Hello, and welcome to the Canadian Story, where we discuss what Canada is, what Canada could be, and what Canada should be. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Canadian Story. I'm very excited for this episode because we're going to be bringing in a non-conservative to talk about why they love Canada. We've been accused, Zach's father-in-law accused us of being the conservative story, so we need to branch out a little bit.
To be fair, I took a look at some of your past episodes.
Yeah, there are a lot of conservatives, so we're trying to mitigate this. But actually, Lisa was introduced to me by one of my best friends, Dan Pujak, who is probably, I think Lisa would agree, one of the best humans in the world.
Totally.
And also a liberal. But when my relationship ended a few years ago, a long-term relationship, he was the one that took me in of all my friends. I had many, many conservative friends, but who did I go live with? My liberal friend. And so I think perhaps listeners to this podcast might think that I'm overly conservative, but I have a lot of liberal friends. So
Did I ever tell you that I kidnapped Dan?
No.
I did. So I was looking for funding for a First Nation up in the Yukon. And we were all in the Yukon at the same time. I think there was some conference going on. And myself, a couple of chiefs, a lawyer, an executive director, we rented one of those big, huge Yukoners.
Yep.
We told Dan we were going to take him for a drive. And I'm pretty sure he was not too sure what was about to happen. But yes, we brought him home, and we did take him on a tour of the land that we were hoping to be able to build on.
Were you successful in the building of that?
Yes, I was.
I thought you might be. So
right.
As we always do on the Canadian Story, what's your favorite thing about Canada? Or what do you love about Canada? Not your favorite thing. Wow.
I truly love the beauty of the country we live in. I've been pretty fortunate in that I grew up in Vancouver. I spent many years in the Okanagan, which is in the interior of BC. And I've been in Ontario for about the last, 18, 19 years. I can't even keep track of time anymore. And I've lived in Ottawa, I've lived in Toronto, and I've been fortunate enough to spend time, as I mentioned, up in the Yukon and many other parts of this country that are just stunningly beautiful. And I think sometimes we take that for granted.
Honestly, the Yukon, I've only been there once. I went on a road trip with a bunch of friends, and I was absolutely in awe of the beauty there. Like,
people are great.
Oh yeah. You kind of have to get to be great people to go and live up there, because it's not an easy place to live. Robert Williams Service, I like to call him the laureate poet of the Yukon, but he talks a lot about like that land will chew you up and spit you out if you're not careful.
Yeah, I've been there every season, and I think even in winter, it's one of the most beautiful places.
Oh, it's just the rugged beauty. And I'm from Alberta, and like there's definitely a huge beauty to that Banff, Jasper, Rocky region, but it's not the same kind of beauty you see in the Yukon, which is just even more rugged. You feel like you're in the wild there.
Oh yeah, I mean I'm a city woman through and through. And every time I'm in the Yukon, it's like I can put on my boots and my parka. I can do this. I probably look ridiculous, but I sure try.
Well, and it's like when you're there, it's like almost like, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, right?
Right.
Yeah. So the beauty, tell us like an experience that you had with that beauty that just really touched you.
Oh, wow. It would have to be in the Yukon. As you know, my firm is predominantly an Indigenous practice, and I've been fortunate enough to represent a number of Indigenous communities and First Nations throughout this country. And I currently represent two of them in the Yukon. And my last trip before coronavirus, COVID hit, was in the Yukon. And I was up visiting both of those First Nations, and they were kind of like in opposite directions. So I spent a lot of time in my car, but driving alone in the middle of winter in the most beautiful climate in the country. And it was that alone piece. The previous year had been interesting for me, and it was just kind of this starting of a almost a rebirth for me. And to be able to do that and have that freeing feeling and driving with that beauty and being able to experience that was just something that I will never forget.
Oh, yeah. There's something about driving, and I always think that Canada has a very unique place in the world because we get to drive so much. And particularly myself, like I grew up in a place where the nearest gas station was 25 kilometers away, right? And so we would have to drive every day to go do anything. And I'm sure it's similar for you, but yeah, it's just being able to drive and just see the natural beauty of this country it's special.
Yeah, and it was hard too because I kept having to pull over so I can stop and take pictures because I was both in Carcross and in the Kluane Lake region, and it was so stunning. I would just pull over, but you didn't even need to because there was nobody around for miles and miles and miles, and it was one of the most isolating yet freeing feelings I've ever experienced, on a road trip like that.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, most of your work has been with First Nations. We've had one First Nations member on the podcast from Carry the Kettle in Saskatchewan, but you have a very broad understanding of their love for this land, their commitment to where they're from. And I'd just like you to speak a little bit about your perspective on how much they love this place.
Well, first of all, I would never want to speak for Indigenous peoples because I think their experiences are very different than mine and ours. Right. As white Canadians, we have a different experience within this country that Indigenous peoples do, whether they're Métis, First Nation, or Inuit. Their experiences have not been good. Mm-hmm. And, a lot of times people know that I do this work and they ask me questions about, and I get the stupid questions too, why can't they just get over it?
Oh yeah.
Must be so nice to get things for free. And there's such a dearth of education on Indigenous history, accurate Indigenous history in this country. And I wish that people were able to, I consider myself so privileged to be able to even have that view to see how kind and generous and they're just wonderful. And they're always willing to teach me, even though the responsibility is my own. I believe that we have an obligation not to make Indigenous peoples and people of color do the heavy lifting on educating white people on Indigenous history. But when you try to put it into perspective, and I always say this, the last residential school in Canada stopped operating the year my youngest child was born.
Yeah.
So this isn't something that happened, 100 years ago. This is something that started happening hundreds of years ago and continues today. So I think it would be very interesting to get the perspective from Indigenous peoples in terms of how they view that.
Well, I would actually. So we did have one, like I said, one already. But I would, if you know any that would like to come on, I would love to get their perspective. I have a lot of admiration. Both Zach and I are hunters, and like the way that they existed for so long here in basically harmony with nature is something that I have a huge amount of admiration for. But more than that, I actually love. This is one part of the culture that I love. I just love this, like you said, their generosity. There's just a generosity of spirit that doesn't exist in Western culture in the same way, from my perspective, from outside looking in. And yeah, if you know anyone who would like to come on to talk about that, I would love that. But going back to your story, so you have a very interesting story from the Canadian perspective of being, be able to rise in a way that doesn't happen in other places in the world.
Yeah, I got lucky. A lot of it, and a lot of it goes to that privilege we spoke to earlier. But yeah, when I was younger, I got pregnant, and I am a feminist. I am vehemently pro-choice, and I decided to have my daughter, who is now given me a grandson, and I adore him. But so I was alone with a small child in Vancouver when I was quite young myself. I was 22 when I had her. And I didn't realize what I was going to be facing in terms of poverty. And, I had thought when I was pregnant, I'll just keep working, I'll bank a lot of money, and I'll go right back to work after I have the baby. Well, the best laid plans, right?
Right.
The money ran out within weeks. And my only option was our social assistance program. So fortunately, I was back out in BC at the time. And I say fortunately because we had a new Democratic provincial government. And at that time, so I'll go back and go forward. So I had my daughter. I was on my own. I was living on social assistance. I wasn't quite sure how I was ever going to get myself out of this mess. Fast forward a few years, I ended up divorced with 2 small children, and I was back in the same situation. So it was like this cycle, right? And people who've never been poor don't understand what a flat tire or a parking ticket or or an extra large utility bill can do to you. And it just puts you in this downward spiral in terms of you're in this hole and you can't ever find a way out. And for me, I decided that my only way out was going to be getting an education. That had to be, that was it. That was the only way. And I remember I went back to the social assistance office, and I only had a financial aid worker because I didn't have any issues with addictions or other things. And I remember saying to her, look, I want to go back to school. I don't know how to do this. And my youngest child at that point, I think was probably about 1.5 years. And she had said to me, well, why bother? You don't get kicked off of welfare until he turns 7. And I was just stunned because basically what she was saying to me is just stick this situation out for another 5.5 years and we'll go from there. And already I was 28 years old and I didn't want to be living on $963 a month for another 5.5 years. I don't think I could have taken it.
Right.
Being poor is exhausting.
Oh, it's stressful, right? It's very stressful.
When you don't know where your next meal's coming from, this shit's hard.
And at that point, nothing else matters, right? Because it's like if you can't feed yourself, that's number one priority.
Totally. And I was very lucky. So I went back and I went to do a college program, and nothing wrong with college programs. But it really wasn't for me. I was focused on getting a skill that would give me a job. And about 3/4 of the way through that first year, the campus director had approached me and said, well, what are you doing? Why are you in this program? And I said, well, look, I need to get a job. I have these kids to support. And he said, well, what would you be doing if you could study whatever you wanted? And I said, well, I would be a lawyer. And he said, well, why don't you do that? And I said, I remember this.
Right.
And this is how young people see age. I remember saying to him, because I'd be 35 before I'm out of school. And I look at 35 now and it's like, God, I wish I was 35. And he said to me, well, you're going to be 35 no matter what.
Right.
So why don't we at least move you into a program that can set you onto the path? So that's one of the places where I think privilege kicked in too. He took me aside. He took me under his wing. He cleared it with the Canada Student Loan Program to make sure I would have that first loan tacked on at the end, and I wouldn't have a barrier created to start my undergraduate degree. And through all of that, and when I say that I was lucky that it was New Democratic government provincially, and I was also lucky that it was a federally Liberal government, is because it wasn't just through hard work that I was able to finish that degree. So I lived in cooperative housing. So I had subsidized housing. Between semesters, I still went back to welfare to get some help. I used food banks. I had subsidized education because BC was on a tuition freeze at that point. I received Canada's student grants because I was a single parent student. So did I do all the heavy lifting? For sure. Like I nearly killed myself trying to finish that damn degree. But were it not for all those systems in place through the state, I would absolutely never have been able to finish that program. And that's also one of the things that I think is really great about our country. We need to do better, but the foundation is there, that social safety net, where we're trying to make sure that people aren't falling through the cracks. We know they are, and we need to do better. But were it not for that social safety net, were it not for a government that said, let's give her a hand up, I never would have been able to change my circumstance.
I do love that. And it's not a typical thought that I have. I would agree that I've been very privileged in my life. And I'm very grateful for I call them blessings. But I think one of the things, and I know you do this a lot, and I really admire it, is when we are given all of these things, it's our duty to give back, right? Is to pay it forward, right? I love that you were like, I don't want to live off $900 a year for the next 5 years. You're like, you wanted to better yourself. So can you go into a little bit of why you think that was different? Because I know some people, I don't think it's that they don't want to better themselves, it's that they don't think they can, right? Maybe they don't believe in themselves. What do you think that is?
I think there's a million different reasons for that. You know, until you've ever sat in a welfare office with a bunch of other people who aren't making eye contact with you because every one of you is goddamn embarrassed to be in there. And you're sitting there and they call your name. And it is humiliating. So people who make comments about, oh, it's so easy to be on welfare. It is the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. It broke my spirit. I remember one day I had to go in and renew my daycare subsidy. That was the other thing. I got free daycare. And I was in the middle of studying for an exam. And this woman actually said to me that my children didn't look poor enough to need this subsidy. And I lost my shit.
Yeah, I would too.
And I said to her, where does it say in that little book of yours there that you're flipping through, where does it say that my kids need to be dirty or poorly behaved or any of those things that we typically think of when we think of welfare recipients? And there's so much of that. So to make a long answer even longer, I guess, until you're in that, you really don't realize that there's humans behind the people who are taking those checks every month. And some of them are just broken by the system. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Or they have addiction issues, or there's abuse issues, or there's a whole host of reasons why they're there in that office. But people need to understand that this is not the easy way in life. You know, I used to hear people all the time, oh, they just go and keep having babies and then their checks get bigger. And it's like, you actually think that getting pregnant, having more children is a good is a good way to make a living on social assistance in this country.
I feel like those people haven't had kids. Like, that is an exhausting. You don't have kids to make your life easier, right?
Or to be poor, right? They don't understand what that's like. I mean, I used to come home from school because I had to commute from Vernon to Kelowna, and I used to come home from school, and every once in a while there'd be like these magically appearing bags of groceries on my stoop. And it was because people knew we were at close to the end of the semester and that my money was probably running out and that my kids could probably really benefit from having some groceries. I think my kids were well into their 20s before they realized that not everyone had Christmas hampers delivered.
Oh, right.
Like, I tried to make sure everything seemed as normal as possible. But I also knew my degree wasn't going to be the only thing to get me out of the situation I found myself in.
So let's go. Oh, so you are working through your degree. You get your degree. Then what happens?
Well, while I was in university, I think it was probably going into third year, I decided to get involved in student politics. I had been invited to join a slate, and I didn't like the idea of a slate because I didn't want to be told what to do. So maybe I was even independent even then.
I love it.
So I ran, and people running against me dropped off, which was great. But I still had to go through a yes/no, and I won that position. And to be fair, part of the reason why I ran was because it came with a $500 a month stipend, and I really needed the cash. But I got into it, and I was the vice president academic for my students' union. And part of my job was to come to Ottawa every 6 months to lobby for post-secondary education. And given that my undergraduate degree is in sociology, I figured it was either I was going to work in chapters or hopefully
or politics.
And it was my last lobby trip before graduation. So we're talking March 2002. And my lobby partner that day couldn't make the last meeting. And it was with some MP I'd never heard of from Manitoba. And it was a blizzard out. I'll never forget it. It was like minus 30 in Ottawa.
Those Ottawa blizzards are nasty.
Right? It was mid-March. It was terrible. And I thought about canceling the meeting. And I said, no, I'll go. And I went to the meeting, and it was with John Harvard, a Liberal MP, I believe, class of 89.
The year I was born.
Shut up. I have shoes older than you.
So you blizzard, you meet this guy.
And I disagreed with with his proposed solution on how we can make post-secondary more accessible to atypical learners like myself. So when you're not coming straight out of high school, when you don't have family support. So I disagreed with him. And basically his follow-up was, do you need a job? And,
and that's like, Canada, right?
You're in the right place at the right time, and you disagree with the right MP.
Oh, yeah. Then boom, life changed.
Yeah. And so I ended up graduating. I put the kids in the car that I wasn't quite sure would make it all the way to Ottawa. And so driving across the country to arrive in Ottawa, and I'll never forget the shitty little apartment we lived in right off the highway before you come
down just before downtown, or like what street? Like how far?
I think
down?
It was like Lee's.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I thought I had hit the damn jackpot. My entry salary was more than I ever made in my entire life. And I'll never forget getting my first check and realizing that it didn't even cover my rent for the month. And it was deeply disappointing, but I really, really enjoyed being on the Hill and having John Harvard as my first boss. All of us who worked for him, we all say that we've all graduated from Harvard.
Oh yeah, I love that.
We didn't have to pay tuition because it was an education. And if you recall, he had been a broadcaster before he was an MP. and he was extremely progressive, even if some of his ideas were a little bit antiquated.
Right.
But he was this really great MP, and I was so fortunate to be able to work for him.
And then you just kept going.
Yeah, it was kind of weird, So after that, he had famously, if you remember your political history, he had given up his seat for Glenn Murray,
mm-hmm.
And in exchange became the lieutenant governor of Manitoba. And after that, I worked for a couple of MPs, one-termers. I went back and I did a postgraduate in public relations, ended up a chief of staff in the Senate after that, and then had been asked to go into Michael Ignatieff's OLO as I had been working on his campaign.
Yeah, well, that's
the real campaign, not the
yes,
not the takeover.
Yes, not the takeover. And that's I just want to talk about this a bit because I think people don't realize how small of a world Canadian politics is, right?
Yeah.
But how accessible it is. Like you started out on student government, just meeting an MP, and he offers you a job because he sees your merit, he sees your ability, he sees your intelligence, right?
He sees that I'm willing to say no to him.
Well, yes, and that's, yeah. We could talk about that. Like, speaking truth to power is a skill set that not everyone has, right?
This is very true.
And I think we've had a few people on the podcast now that have said their favorite thing about, or the thing they love most about Canada is how much opportunity there is here. And I was just in an Uber ride here, and I had this amazing Nigerian guy who was telling me about all the places he's lived in the world, Germany, the UK, the US. And he said, David, there's nowhere like Canada. Nowhere in the whole world. He said, nowhere where I can come, and I'm just accepted, and everyone is kind to me. And not only that, I can make money. And he's like, all I want to make is $200 a day, and I can pay for my rent, I can pay for my food, I can pay for my car, and I'm happy. And I thought, that's what we are. That's Canada. Is opportunity. And I think the saddest part of the First Nation stuff, which we don't have to talk about too much, is that we've literally taken their opportunities away. We took their culture away. We took their children away. Yeah. We took everything away. We stole their land. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's that's the great black mark that we're going to have to figure out as a country, and I think we have to figure it out as not partisanly, right? It can't be a partisan. This cannot become a partisan issue. If we make First Nations reconciliation a partisan issue, we'll never get it over the line. It has to be cross-party. Well, I have to say, so as a lobbyist myself, who's lobbied for Indigenous communities through Liberal and Conservative governments, I would suggest that your party has some work to do. Mine does too. Don't get me wrong. We have way more than work to do. We need to change our whole mindset. Thank you for saying that. Oh yeah, and I've said that to Aaron. I've said that to Jason Kenney. I think Jason Kenney is sort of getting it a little bit, but it's all too focused on resources. It can't be about resources. It can't be about what we can get from the First Nations as a country. It needs to be how can we truly and deeply show them respect? It has to be about respect. Well, and it can't be performative, right? It can't just be words. It has to be action. Yes. I would think that one thing that we could probably do is stop, as Canada, we could probably stop suing them in court. That would be great, right? That would be great. It's not just Indigenous peoples as well. There was this kind of great awakening last summer, when we were all stuck in our homes and we were watching American and Canadian news. And if you recall, through May, June, July, we had the deaths in the States of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, and other Black men and women at the hands of police. But at the same time, in Canada, what we were also seeing is between about April and the end of June, we saw about 6 Indigenous men and women who'd also been killed by police. And there was this, for that moment,
this kind of awakening about how we need to do better for, racialized peoples.
Yes, yes.
We had that on the Hill on June 6th. I went down because I felt that it was more important than me sitting in my condo by myself. I went to the Hill for the protest. And we really need to make sure that those people we're speaking about, Black Canadians, Indigenous peoples, Asian men and women, of all races, they need to be part of the conversation. It can't just be a bunch of white politicians sitting around trying to figure out how we solve these problems, because that's not anything that's going to work. It hasn't worked. It's just made it worse.
Well, it's impossible for us to understand their lived experience, right? I do 100%. Just as I feel like it is impossible for, a lot of Ontarians to understand the lived experience of Albertans. It's not the same as race, and it's not the same as privilege, but like there are a lot of lived experiences that cannot be understood unless you've lived them, right?
Yeah, although I would be very hesitant in comparing regional cleavages to lived experiences by
that's probably a partisan thing between the two of us, right?
Yes, because I have to say, being from BC, every time I say I'm from out west, an Albertan will always correct me. Correct me.
Albertans we're an ornery bunch. We're an ornery bunch.
It's like, you're not from out west. You're from the West Coast.
Yeah. It's as if it was some identity. Yeah, it's interesting that BC. Let's talk about BC for a little bit, because I love BC. I've lived about 5 years there. I think it's like you said, what a beautiful country we live in. But BC is a special kind of beautiful. I mean, all the areas of Canada are, but BC is a special kind of beautiful. What's your favorite kind of? I'll tell you mine. I love walking along the waterfront in Vancouver on the other side where the downtown is against the mountain. Like, is there a more beautiful view in the world? I don't know.
I got to tell you, when I moved to Ontario, I couldn't get any sense of direction because there's no mountains here.
Yeah, how are you going to orientate?
Right? I couldn't. It was finally, I think it was Harvard himself who told me, just if you're looking for north, look toward the Peace Tower. Because there was nothing else in the horizon. But you're right. And for me, while I love Vancouver proper, and my daughter was little when we lived in the West End, and I loved walking along the seawall and taking her through Stanley Park and English Bay. The Okanagan, to me, is one of the most beautiful places in the country. And it's because it's not just for its geography, which is stunning. And if you've ever done that drive between Kelowna and Vernon, overlooking the lake system, it's gorgeous. And, it's this semi-arid desert climate. So winters aren't too bad. And, you're back in, a light jacket by the end of February. And it's just this perfect combination of weather and geographic beauty between the mountains. And, in the Okanagan, you can go to the lake in the morning and you can be skiing by afternoon.
Oh yeah, I have a friend. You know Colin Weirs? I probably not. He was in the Conservative War Room in 2019, and we went to school together. But he once told me, he's like, if there is anywhere on Earth that is the Garden of Eden, it's the Okanagan.
Yeah, it's stunningly beautiful.
Going back to what you were saying, what ways do you think we can help bring those people to the table? Like, I'm not a big fan of affirmative action. I know there's a lot of people who are, but I do completely agree with the notion that we need to be bringing people to the table. We want more of them at the table. Part of what I do and you do as well is politics, is campaigning, and I love campaigning with immigrants, with racialized people. They're my favorite candidates because they love this country so much. Like that Nigerian fellow that I was just in the cab with, in the Uber with. Like, he says to me, the love of this country was oozing off of him. He's like, this is the place that I want to spend the rest of my life and bring my family to. How do we take that love of country, which these people have, and embrace it properly?
Wow. Yeah. And again, I don't want to speak for Indigenous peoples or racialized Canadians, so I'll speak to another issue, which is gender, which has also been a problem in politics.
Massive
problem. And it's getting better. But sometimes I think, we all sit around and talk academically about things that we need to do to change things. But sometimes you just have to disrupt the system. And going back to 2015, and I know there was a lot of criticism of the Prime Minister for doing this, but he absolutely disrupted the system by having a gender parity cabinet.
Yes, true.
And I know there was huge criticism, particularly from the right, about, and this is again an issue that women have to deal with in politics, because immediately people went on the attack on those women's credentials in a way that we do not talk about men's credentials in politics.
I know, it's actually disgusting. I've worked for primarily women in politics. Shelley Glover, Danielle Smith, Ronna Ambrose, and the stress that they go through in politics is, and I've also worked for Ed Fast, Stephen Harper, Jason Kenney, and one of the things that I found is the level of stress that the women are under is about 10 or 15 times more than all of the men. It doesn't matter what the position is, because they have this burden of trying to prove even more that they're worthy of the position. It's ridiculous.
Well, and then we're still dealing with sexism. We're still dealing with men who don't understand boundaries.
Oh, yeah. That's a huge problem.
It is still something that continues. And I'm saying this as a white woman. So imagine if you are a racialized female and all of a sudden you find yourself elected to the House of Commons. And now you have to fit into a system that was never designed nor created nor expected that you would be part of it. And being a woman myself who is in a male-dominated profession, I think I do business very differently than a lot of my male colleagues. And it's not that I do it better, but it is that I do it differently. There is no question. And so to that point, what women have to deal with in politics is, and I always hate it when I hear, women hate the thrust and parry of the House of Commons. They hate that back and forth. I love that shit, but I'm also a political animal.
Yeah,
right. So I might be a little different than many women in that case, but I think it has less to do with that and more to do with the fact that women don't maybe feel as welcome or as included, and so when the Prime Minister did that and had a gender parity cabinet, I think following that, we've seen it in other countries as well. And we've definitely seen it with Joe Biden, the new president of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
He is an all-female communication staff. I think there's an Indigenous woman who is being confirmed this week for the first time in history.
Yeah.
Right? So it is incumbent upon our leaders to potentially take some political risks and disrupt the system.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting point. I'd never thought of it that way, as disrupting the system, but I like that. I really do like that. One of the things that I've noticed a lot in politics is that often, particularly in partisan politics, we go to the lowest common denominator to attack one another. Right? We'll straw man our opponent's positions, and it's all. I mean, this is a game of shadows and propaganda, and that's what we do to a degree. But at the end of the day, I've always found, and I don't know if you found this, in Ottawa, the staffers all talk to one another. They all hang out. They're like, we all know one another, right? We drink together, I don't think that the rest of the country realizes that it's not quite as vicious as perhaps it appears to the public.
Yeah, it is interesting, so being a woman in my 50s, my peers aren't the staff anymore. My peers are those who were elected. And I have a number of friends who are elected MPs in all three of the main parties. And people like us who understand how this works, that we know how to put down our swords at the end of the day and have a beer with one another. The Twitterati, they don't understand it. They don't understand that I can call out your leader for that stupid video in front of the PMO.
That was an interesting video for sure.
With the goddamn porta potty. Like, I can call that out, but I can go for a beer with you at the end of the day.
Oh, exactly.
Because I think we all view it as we're all doing our jobs.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We're all members of our parties. I think all of us, one of the things we probably have in common is that we're also not afraid to criticize when it's required.
Yes.
Because sometimes friends have to be honest with each other. But at the same time, there's not that level of viciousness among most of us who've been around this business for a long time.
And the truly vicious ones don't survive. Like vicious for viciousness sake. You know what I mean?
Totally. And the older I get, I'm still a partisan, and I'll go on the radio and I'll defend or promote depending upon what the issues of the day are. But I'd like to think that, as I've gotten older, I'm able to also see the viewpoints of people I don't necessarily agree with. And I'll never forget, it was actually back in university. I went to a very small school. And so we always had the same profs over and over again. And I had this favorite political science prof. So I only took his classes. And he would call me Pinko all the time.
That's funny because I get called Bubble Boy when from my left wing profs who I love.
and he was a conservative, and one day he raised something in class that I vehemently disagreed with, and I went to speak with him about it after class, and he looked at me and he said, "Why do you think you're right?" And I took a step back. And he said to me, as wrong as you think I am, my team thinks you're wrong.
Yeah.
Thinks you're just as wrong. Thinks that your viewpoint is just as extreme as you think my viewpoint is. And I think that's helped me in politics because it's allowed me, and I think my undergraduate degree too, that's where sociology actually has been helpful, in that it allows me to look at the role of the other. So to see through a lens of somebody else who may not have my same lived experiences or share my political viewpoints. But I think that part is really important too, is that understanding. And it's allowed me then to be able to kind of figure out strategy and tactics, because if I'm able to figure out where you're going and why you're doing that, I'm able to figure out how to counter that in the best way possible.
Yeah, no, that's true.
Like not putting up videos of your leader in front of the PMO with a porta potty.
Okay. No, I agree.
We can attack the NDP for their stupid letter this week.
Well, there's been a lot of interesting things. We could also talk about, not opposing genocide. But one of the things that really interests me in what you just said is about the difference between us who know each other and work together and the Twitter people. And what I'm really worried about, this is probably, and I'm actually more worried about this on the right than the left, to be honest, because the left, they're actually genuinely, usually compassionate people deep down, and they're doing it because they care about justice and these kind of things. The right is about order and other things, right? And this is just the nature of psychology, right? And both are needed, right? You need a conscience, but you also need to build things. What worries me though is all of this. I'm going to call it fake news for like this QAnon stuff. There's literally people who believe that there's this giant pedophile ring, that the only person standing in the way of that pedophile ring is Donald Trump of all people. Like, the righteous warrior Donald Trump, come on. Like, how deluded do you have to be? But people are. And it's not just crazy people. Tons of people are starting to believe this. And what worries me is people like yourself and I who spend a lot of time out there promoting and defending our respective positions. I think it is incumbent on us to be a little bit more careful about the things we say, because we're driving a wedge in the population that is becoming a civil war.
No question. I read something. I saw a little clip of video last night. What's her name? Marjorie Taylor Greene, that U.S. QAnon representative.
Yes.
So there's another representative who has a trans child, and the Democrats are trying to, do some inclusivity with respect to some of the items on their agenda. And this QAnon representative took this big, huge sign and put it up on the wall directly in front of that woman's office that basically said there are only two genders, or it was about a bathroom. I can't remember, but it was just like, if that is happening inside those buildings, we have to be paying much more attention to what's happening outside those buildings. And I think it's incumbent on our political leaders as well, who may have people like that in their caucuses, who have, and I'm being very careful with my language here, because I think we all know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
That who are espousing conspiracy viewpoints. And
not only that, utilizing them to pump. And you know what? Your party does it all the time too, right? On different stuff. But we have to stop. We're literally. There's a great verse in the Bible where it says, if you teach one of these little ones to stumble, it would be better for a millstone to be tied around your neck and thrown into the ocean. And I feel like as leaders, yourself and I, having worked for some of the most powerful people in Canada, we have a higher responsibility for the words we're using. And when Justin Trudeau calls white people racist and just goes on and on and on about how racist white people are, he's not helping anything. He's not making people less racist, I'll tell you that much. He's making them more racist.
But it is important to be talking about, we talked earlier about those 6 Indigenous men and women who were killed at the hands of police. So, and then what we had an RCMP commissioner who at the time refused to use the word systemic racism. And systemic racism is a necessary conversation. And it's something that white people need to get uncomfortable with. We've been comfortable for a very long time. And we need to acknowledge that there is systemic racism in this country. And it is in the lives of racialized Canadians every day. We just saw yesterday, there was a story that broke about an employee who worked for the Governor General who had written an internal email about, I think that it was the death of George Floyd.
Right.
And she was reprimanded for it. And now I think I saw quickly another story this morning of another Black woman who works within the public service who is also speaking out. So speaking of our public service, why is it that every single ADM, every single DM is a white person, except for one? Well, that's a problem.
Yeah, it's a huge problem.
It's a problem. And that's the thing. People also don't understand that about the public service, is that political staff change with the will of the government, right?
Yeah,
you serve at the pleasure of your member or minister or
and you
leader.
have no job security. It's like...
Exactly. But people don't understand that the civil servants stay. They stay, like after Harper's nearly, I think, what was it, 10 years? After a decade of
nine, we almost made 10.
Almost made 10. So after a decade of Harper, when we have a new government that has committed to reconciliation during an election, and I'm sitting in the office of what's now called CERNAC, but was INAC at the time, and it's literally the civil servants who are still guiding policy because they're the ones who've been drafting it for the last 10 years. And now we're saying we need to pivot. And that part is what is the constant in politics. And we can't do any of this without the civil servants. Like what they've been managed to pull off during COVID, regardless of political stripe, because they're apolitical, they have done a fantastic job in terms of working their asses off to make sure that Canadians had the necessary supports. But for sure, that needs to change. So you said earlier that you don't necessarily believe in affirmative action. So you tell me how that changes.
Well, that's what I don't have an answer. That's the problem. And that's why I asked you. I want them to be as successful or even more successful. So one of my policies in life is when I hire someone, I want them to become better at everything that I do than me. And then once they do, then I want them to go and do their things, right? That's how I live my life. And that's what I want to see, right? But I just don't know. It's like you said, I don't want to go and tell them how to do things, right? I don't want to go and I don't want to be the white man savior. I hate that idea, right? So I don't even know how I can help. But the problem that I have with affirmative action, it's really the conservative problem, is merit now is all that matters to me. Your skin color doesn't matter. Your religion doesn't matter. It's can you do the job and are you good at it?
Except most people have unconscious bias.
Yeah, that is something that I need to think about more. And I've definitely seen all the time. But
right, if it was all merit-based, we would not have a 99.9% white civil service.
No, you're absolutely. I completely and 100% agree. And actually, I think one of the barriers there, as a Westerner, as we were just talking about, is actually bilingualism. But we don't have to get into. We are running out of time here.
That's a challenge too. I never had the opportunity of immersion when I was a kid.
No, and as an Albertan, there was obviously programs that I could have gone into, but I had no one to talk to in French of where I was from, and so I never got that opportunity, and that definitely stunted. That's bias. That's bias right there. That is a gatekeeping way of keeping things a certain way.
But I get it, right? We're a bilingual country. We just didn't set it up really well.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's it. I don't have a problem with being bilingual. I have a problem with how we set it up. exactly.
But at the end of the day, it's, to me, in terms of our problems, it's like way down here. And the problems that we need to be addressing, is the fact that we do not have a racially diverse Canadian political system. We don't have a racially diverse House of Commons. We don't have a racially diverse civil service or the political staff.
But we do have a racially diverse country, and I think our politics should become more representative of what we are as a country. Because the Canadian story is it doesn't matter what God you worship. It doesn't matter what color your skin is. This should be the Canadian story. And it doesn't matter. None of the cultural things about you determine your value in the eyes of the state. You are all equal.
But we do know, but we need to, and I think it's important. And it's one of the things that I consider personally important, that I am obligated to learn about our true Canadian history and what part we played and what has happened to those people who have been historically discriminated against and who still
I completely agree with you.
Facing those problems. So that, if anything out of COVID, because I think one of the things that we've seen are, this wasn't the great equalizer, like a lot of people said at the beginning. This really did expose big cleavages in society. And part of that is, poverty. We need to do better. We need to do better on housing security. We need to do better on how we care for our elders. And we need to do better with racial justice.
Yep, I agree with all of those. Zach, when Erin was on, she mentioned a book. Do you remember what it was about? So there's a great book. We'll put it in the show notes because I don't remember the title, but it was about the experience of Japanese Canadians who were put in internment camps during World War II here in Canada, and how they overcame that and came to forgive Canada for that. And I've always thought that's just their story. Right? They got to tell it and I get to read it. And that's a beautiful thing, right? That's their journey. And I agree with you. It's incumbent upon us to educate ourselves on things like that. Because there's that great line, once you truly know someone, it's very hard to hate them. Unless obviously they're horrible.
So actually on that topic, Lisa, I had a question for you. You mentioned earlier a lack of education or even a miseducation regarding the Indigenous population. Where would you point our listeners to for accurate, honest information, and where do they go to get more educated?
I would start with your local bookstore. There are a ton of books written by Indigenous authors right now that share a lot of those experiences. I also on Twitter follow a lot of Indigenous journalists because I appreciate their perspective and the stories that they tell. But yeah, I mean, that's part of it. What do I wish that kids would come out of K-12 with an understanding of our history in an accurate way? That would be great, but it's not happening. So I know with my grandson, we're already buying him books that talk about, these issues in a way that a preschooler can relate to. And it's an important part of how I would like him to come up, both, on a gender piece and on a racial piece. I want him to be aware and educated on those issues.
I love that. We have to go here shortly, but this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for making us not just a conservative podcast.
You're welcome.
You're very brave of you to come on this conservative, the conservative story as a liberal. But I think the listeners are going to gain a lot from what you had to say, and I really appreciate just your perspective, which is in some ways different than mine, but also opening my mind up to ways that my party can do better, which is really everyone should want to be doing better.
I think so too. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to The Canadian Story. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at The CAD Story. That's The CAD Story. If you enjoy this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. Let's work together to remind Canadians how great their country is.